graphic novelist, Maureen Burdock.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. So can I take it away?
Yes, you can, by all
All
means.
right, okay. So I was wondering for like I'm looking at you guys and I'm thinking, oh, these people look like super experienced cartoonists. No?
I'd like to think so.
Okay, so so what I prepared was I have a few slides to show you my process. And I teach comics. I teach comics through Saw online and through the Literary Kitchen, which is a writer based in Oakland. And I've done autobiographical comics, so autographics course through them, and I've taught graphic medicine at SAW, and I'm about to teach another graphic medicine deep dive through the Literary Kitchen. So my process, the slides that I'm talking about, I also use in teaching. So, if you're more experienced, you've likely developed your own process. And so and everybody eventually will. So this is really unique to me and might help people who have less of a process developed figure it out for themselves. So it's that little preface. And then I have some work to share from my graphic memoir, Queen of Snails. And I also have a section that I'm hoping to share from my new book that's coming out. It's in production now at Graphic Mundi Press, and it's coming out in November. And it's called Sleepless Planet, a graphic guide to healing from insomnia. So, graphic medicine in practice, I had horrible insomnia since age 4 and I'm 55 now, so 50 years of insomnia. And I finally said, I'm going to make a graphic novel about this. And hopefully, by the time it's done, I'll finally be sleeping a little bit better. So it took me 3 years to produce this book, and I can very happily report that I sleep 7+ hours nightly, with the occasional issue, but very occasional. So I now define myself as a decently good sleeper. So I'm hoping to share just the intro to that book with you too. All right, let me share what I've got here. Oh, this is the course that I'm going to be teaching. You can see some of the titles that I'm looking at. So I'm looking at the intersection of comics and healthcare, uh, illness narratives. We're looking at kind of a broad view of graphic medicine. So I'm also looking at gender issues being discussed, identity issues being discussed, racial issues, aging, healing from trauma, things like that. So not just straight up health narratives. Okay. All right. A glimpse into the habits and habitat. Can y'all see okay with it like this?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, cool. So I mostly have been working on nonfiction comics and nonfiction writing. I did this graphic memoir as my graphic dissertation, actually, in cultural studies at the University of California, Davis, UC Davis. And that came out in 2022. And I finished it and expanded it after I finished my PhD, and then Graphic Mundi published it in 2022. And I've worked on, so that was my second graphic novel full-length project. I've also appeared in various anthologies, including COVID Chronicles, and the piece I did for that is titled The Right to Breathe. And and I have the opening story in the book Menopause, which won an Eisner Award, and was very pleased with that. So as I'm developing my work, I'll just launch right in here. The first thing I look at is kind of determining the shape of the project and looking at broad strokes, like what are the themes, what are the storylines, what's the scope going to be, and what does the shape look like? Because as a visual storyteller, I want to look at, I want to kind of think about the work from the very beginning as a form, as a visible physical form. And we all grew up with this. Does this look familiar?
Yeah.
The storyline, the story arc, where you have the exposition, conflict, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. And I was in my early 20s, and I was at the Art Institute in Chicago, and I was in a creative writing class, and the professor presented this again. And I thought, gosh, that looks really phallic. Like, that's a really phallic shape. That looks like a penis. And I thought, and then years later, I was teaching college writing at UC Davis, and I thought, I got to come up with some different shapes. So I came up with some different shapes, and I drew them and showed them to my students, and then had them come up with their own shape of their story that they were working on. And, first, here's a circle, basic. It can work well, I think, for shorter works like a mini comic or a short story. The protagonist embarks on a journey. The story eventually takes us back to the beginning, but with some new knowledge gained. So like a hero's journey kind of story, you could depict it as this donut shape, right? Then, kind of complicating things a little bit, I envision the spiral narrative. And this shape, I think, works really well for a personal growth narrative. Though I don't know if you're familiar with Elizabeth Trembley's book, Look Again. She finds a dead body in the woods, and she's really traumatized by this experience. She's out there by herself with her dogs. She finds this guy hanging from a tree branch, and she revisits that moment again and again in her graphic narrative. And every time she revisits it, she's talking to somebody else who she had talked to that day, or she goes back to the place, and she gathers a little bit more insight, a little bit more information. So her memory of the event actually changes. And that's, I think, represented well by the spiral. And I actually mentioned this to her, and she's like, oh my God, that's crazy, because that's exactly the shape I drew when I started writing this story. So it's like every time you kind of start in the center, and every time you come around the curve again, things look kind of familiar but different. You know that Asian expression, same, but different? It looks like similar, but you have new information, so it looks different. This is also a wise woman kind of model for how we look at time rather than linear. Then there's the web. So the spider has this really interesting process of casting these ley lines, these stabilizing broad strokes lines, and then weaving the spiral to tie it together. So you could construct a story this way with lots of different kind of foundational stories, and then the narrative kind of ties them together. That would be an interesting, very complex way of creating a work. Then I looked at the helix or super helix, or a rope or a braid that contains multiple sub-themes that are woven together to tackle bigger, broader topics. And I found this helpful for moving from the personal to the familial to the cultural and then the historical, which was what I was aspiring to do with my graphic memoir. And I actually gave this to my dissertation committee. I showed them my timeline. This is, my autobiographical timeline, but starting before my birth. So looking at historical kind of trajectories, tendrils, and then interwoven with the birth of my parents, birth of my grandparents, birth of my parents, birth of my children, and kind of the historic events that continue to affect us as a family and then as a larger community. So I created this shape to, as I was thinking through how I was going to construct my graphic memoir. So I've come up with this prompt for students, so you're welcome to screenshot this. We don't have time to do it right now, but if it's something that you'd like to play with later, I have my people do this when I'm teaching. So thinking through the shape of a project, I think this can be really helpful when you're starting a new, larger project. And then kind of defining on where you're located as a narrator. Are you a first person narrator? Are you omniscient? Is this unfolding in real time as you're living through it? And then the next thing that I do, or have people I'm working with do, students do, is a mind map. Have any of you done the mind map before?
No,
Not so
a
much.
technique that's been recommended.
What's that, Bill?
It's a technique that's been recommended before.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful. I know it helps me. I just started doing these recently, but I find them really useful. So this is one that a student did about her graphic medicine project. And you'd kind of start in the center of the page typically, and then you just kind of rewrite outward. And I like this because it's visual, right? So for us visual thinkers, this is really, really helpful. You see, start with a central kind of theme or potential title for your story. And then you kind of draw like these lines outward from it, kind of a spider's web idea where you're just weaving broad strokes what your story will be about. And it's a pre-writing, pre-drawing exercise, so you're not bound to anything. It's just really quick and dirty and colorful. This is an example from Nick Susanis, who did the book Unflattening. My friend in San Francisco, he teaches at SF State. He's a fabulous, fabulous cartoonist and teacher, wonderful guy. And this is just a tiny section of his mind map for Unflattening. And you can see how crazy detailed it is. You could really get lost in there, huh?
Yes.
That's just 2 out of I don't know how many pages he did in preparation. You can see just the thinking on paper that's happening before drawing any panels or doing any scripting. I gave this creative prompt that was a couple slides ago of finding the shape of your story to one of my students who is working on his first graphic novel, longer comic. And he just started drawing during the pandemic. So he's pretty new at drawing. And he came up, and I'm using this with his permission. He came up with this brilliant concept. His story is about a robot that he remembers having as a child. And the robot toy, he wasn't able to track it down later. As an adult, he tried to find the manufacturer of the toy and he couldn't. So he's questioning his own memories of his childhood. And the robot had a name, Max. And he remembers it having these compartments in its chest, in its like chest cavity. And so he's turned the compartments he used to put his toys in, as far as his memory serves him, he's turned them into the chapter titles.
Hmm.
And I think it's going to be an amazing book. I just thought this was so cool. I'm showing him like circles and braids and things like that, and he comes up with the robot. So,
Hmm.
like, I love that. So you can do anything, may come up with any shape that fits with your story and with your sensibilities. All right, so usually one of the other first things I start doing along with mind mapping and looking at the shape of the story is just thinking of the characters. And these are different ones I've done for clients, because I also do graphic novels for clients and illustration for people. And that's usually one of the first things I do is I have them describe the characters to me, and then I'll give them sketches, and usually there's a round or two of changes, because what they see in their head as the writer is going to be really different from what I see as the artist. And for my own work, I also really spend a lot of time developing characters. And I'm actually working on a fiction novel now, and I'm spending just as much time working on the characters and drawing them and thinking about their biographies as I would, with a graphic novel or a comic for a client. So, what makes them tick? Who are their parents? What kind of personality tics do they have? Do they have nervous habits? What's their issue that they need to resolve? What's going to get in their way? What are their special powers or skills or tools that might help them along the way? So here's an example. There's some that I did recently for this guy who's doing a spoof, a satire on medieval fantasy, on the medieval fantasy genre. It's hilarious. And he's got, the wizard, and the big heart is the main protagonist, and the main protagonist's love interest. So we went through several rounds of, coming up with the characters. I had looked at motorcycle type of dudes, like, Rough Rider kind of biker gang dudes for the wizard. And so I had him with these funky glasses and kind of a scraggly beard, but we lost the glasses and changed his nose, and his beard got longer, and different things like that. He wanted him to look kind of thread worn. So that was a lot of fun. And then eventually there's the color version of the cast of characters. And I did that before doing any pages of his story. And then there they are appearing in the story. There's the main protagonist, Big Heart. And on the right, you can see it with text laid out in Adobe InDesign, which I use to do the text and the speech bubbles and stuff. So there's Big Heart thinking, I am not a hero. Spoiler alert, he's the hero. It's pretty funny. Blizzard the wizard, he's only as powerful as you believe him to be, so not very powerful. He's going, hey, that's really uncalled for. So next, I launch into doing quite a bit of research in my case, because I've mostly been working on nonfiction for myself, for my own projects. Have this interest in nonfiction. So here's an example from Queen of Snails, where I wanted to know more about what happened to children at the end of World War II. I was writing about my mother's experiences, and she was displaced during World War II from Silesia, which is Poland now. So she was displaced by the Russian army. And then her father took her and dumped her in an orphanage. So I wanted to know more about other children's experiences during and at the end of and just post World War II. And so I found writings of different people, including this social worker at the time, and talking about the impact of the war on the children, and they were called wolf children. So I kept track of my research, and that became later endnotes in the book, which was really an important aspect if you're working on nonfiction, to kind of track your research so you can find it again later if you need to cite it, reference it, prove that you actually, did your work. So this was Alice Bailey. And of course, you can see I used the image of her, a lot of visual research as well, talking about those peculiar and wild children of Europe and of China, to whom the name wolf children has been given. And they were just a lot of kids running wild with no parents around, children whose parents were, put in camps, put in concentration camps, killed in the war, displaced, etc. And so once I've started kind of developing the characters and I've come up with the shape of my story, and I'm beginning to, maybe I've written an outline, then the next thing that I do is I come up with a template. So I determine my page size and layout, and I do that often by admiring other graphic novelists' books. And I'll actually, I think for Queen of Snails, I used Blankets by Craig Thompson, because I really love the visual look and feel of that book. And I'll take my ruler and I'll measure the book, and I'll look to see how big the gutters are, how wide are the gutters, how big are the margins. And I worked for years as a book designer, so I happen to know, you want to have a little bit more room towards the center margins, because if you put art too close to the center, it'll get lost in the fold, in the binding area. So these things are kind of good to think about when you're just starting the project, right? Because you don't want to end up with a lot of really beautiful art that gets lost in the gutter or gets cut off if you didn't leave enough room for your margins. And then I actually turned that into like a guide for doing my thumbnails. So the template that I just showed you, I like shrink it down. I scanned it in, I shrunk it down and did like 4 up on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So I could have 4 thumbnails per page. And that's actually pretty big for thumbnails, right? But I like having a lot of details in my thumbnails. So for Queen of Snails, I penciled in my thumbnails and did the writing more or less simultaneously. So I had an outline, but then I would kind of script along with doing the rough sketches in my thumbnails. And that worked really well for that project. And then when I worked on the book that's in production now, Sleepless Planet, I actually did the whole script first in Word and then did the thumbnails. Like I did a little bit of the script, and then I did a little bit of thumbnails, and I did the whole book that way and sent that to the publisher before I did any ink. So, that's just saves a lot of time if you end up changing things, which inevitably will, that you have not spent precious time, inking and God forbid coloring and doing all of these things. They become very precious, and it makes it much harder to change things or to throw out, a series of pages because you realize they're not really necessary, or you'd rather replace them with something else. So I learned that kind of the hard way with my first book. And I think a lot of us doing too much final art, what we think will be final art before we kind of roughed out the whole book. And so this is from the current book where I then created my font in calligrapher.com. With Queen of Snails, I hand lettered the whole book. So that's all. I hand lettered 232 pages. And I did it at, I think it was 150%. So I did it on big boards, big illustration boards, and then used a large format scanner and then shrunk it down. And the final book is like 5x8. So I think actually it was probably at least 200% by the time all was said and done. So the art was at twice the size of the final pages. So then you have to take that into account too if you're hand lettering, and if you're doing it at larger than final size, you have to figure out how big to make your lettering, right? So that it's still legible when you shrink it down. So a lot of good things to consider when you're starting your project. So this was much easier. I did it at 100%. So I made a template for 6x9 trade paperback, and I thought, it seemed urgent. I wanted to help myself sleep, and I wanted other people to have access to this ASAP too, because I know a lot of people who struggle with sleep. So I worked faster on this one. I did it at 100% rather than 200%. And I created a digital font so that I could edit more easily. Gosh, so much easier. And then, yeah, so you're drawing and lettering your final pages, and then have like the happy, last but not least, finding somebody to publish the work or self-publishing it, and then promoting it. So here I am. This was at TCAF with Graphic Mundi. That's Kendra, the publisher of Graphic Mundi, next to me, and another wonderful author, Seth Martell, who wrote The Mayor, and a wonderful woman who was working for the press at the time. So yeah, I feel like this is, I always compare it to cooking a really extravagant multi-course meal. And it's fun to cook and it's fun to eat, but it's not really, like, to me, it's never totally satisfying until I've shared it with more people. It's a little disappointing if you spend, a long time cooking a multi-course meal and then nobody shows up to enjoy the banquet, right? So so I have, like I said, I have two possibilities to share, and I'm not sure we'll have time to do both. So I'm going to let you pick. Do you want some pages from Queen of Snails, or do you want the intro section from Sleepless Planet?
Sleepless Planet.
Sleepless Planet?
Yeah.
Yeah, you got insomnia? Is that okay with everybody?
Sure.
It's
Okay.
fine.
Okay, I'll do Sleepless Planet. All right, here we go. I'm gonna go full screen. Can you see it?
Oh,
Okay.
wait, I actually picking my nose.
You see it okay?
Yeah.
So that's
Yes.
cool.
So we're
So
looking at stylized neurons here.
Yeah, and neurons, neuronal network going on here. So I saved this as spreads. So, right, so you could see left hand, right hand page at the same time. Introductions. I'm going to read the introduction. And on the left there, that's Kiki the koala bear. Hello there, mates. I'm Kiki. As someone who sleeps about 20 hours a day, I am a sleep expert, truly one of the best sleepers you'll ever meet. Allow me to be your introduction to this book about finding better sleep. Before the arrival of colonists in 1788, there were about 10 million of my kind in Australia. Not much more than 2 centuries later, fewer than, I think it says 10,000. I've got a thing covering the writing of us remain. So they're nearly extinct, koalas. What has caused koalas to join so many other animals on the rapidly growing endangered species list? Deforestation, brush fires of increasing magnitude, urbanization, and hunting. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, fur traders slaughtered 8 million koalas for the hat and coat industry. You could say that the decline of koalas is all due to insatiable human greed. I like my koala hat, but now I need a fur coat to match. A pathological hunger for more, an unbridled compulsion to consume, coupled with constant pressure to produce, afflicts multitudes around the globe. In short, humans are a rapacious and invasive species that has been busily eating away at the planet since we arrived. Kind of like termites, except that termites actually play a vital role in the ecosystem, whereas humans tend to take more than we need, upsetting planetary homeostasis. This feeding frenzy is making planet Earth uninhabitable by Earthlings, human and non-human alike. Can we stop it before it's too late? Oof. Thanks, Kiki. I can take it from here. Hi there. Could someone please make this stop? Without being fully aware of it, I too had been swept along by this culture of perpetual progress. I began to wonder if my need to be productive was undermining my sleep. Tasks, urgent and endless. I've suffered from terrible and at times debilitating insomnia since early childhood. This worsened in adulthood as I came to believe that productivity was the measure of one's success. I can sleep when I'm dead, ha ha. I made wisecracks like this one as a coping mechanism. Instead of salubrious sleep weeks, I resigned myself to a frustrating loop of anxiety, sleeplessness, and fatigue. I knew this wasn't good. It occurred to me that my body was telling me that I needed to understand the causes of my sleeplessness and then make the necessary lifestyle changes to address them. So I began this book as a personal quest for better sleep. Ouch! If I don't make some real changes to improve my sleep, this isn't going to end well. It might be helpful to write and draw about the things I plan to try, not just for my own sake, but also for others who struggle with insomnia. I knew I had some bad habits to unlearn. For example, I would compensate for my fatigue with 2 or 3 cups of coffee in the mornings. Tired, wired, morning caffeine brain. And I relied on a glass or 2 of wine in the evenings to help me wind down. Winding down, evening brain. Little did I know how much the process of making this book would change me. My anxiety and insomnia were so chronic that I had just assumed they were part of my identity, that they were my normal. Chronic anxiety, dark circles under the eyes, shoulders in the vicinity of my ears, shallow chest breathing when I remembered to breathe at all. Email apnea is a real thing. Stiff hips from chronic sitting after my morning runs. Stomach easily upset, fatigue, tense body, aching joints. Type A, high-achieving, hardworking, runner, artist, Capricorn, insomniac. I was even a bit proud that I could seemingly function with less sleep than most people. My resolution to work intensively on my insomnia and to create this book about it, how it made me stop and take it closer, And to create this book about it made me stop and take a closer look at myself. It was humbling to realize how some of my thinking and behaviors mirrored industrial capitalist beliefs that are devastating on a social and planetary scale. I had this compulsion to be productive for a set number of hours daily, coupled with the fear of being considered lazy if those productivity targets weren't met, a constant fear of falling short, the belief that simply being kind and helpful in the world wasn't enough, the propensity to want to escape via mindless entertainment and less than optimal health habits. My insomniac mindset was endangering me. I was beginning to experience physical and mental burnout. Never had the feminist adage, the personal is political, sounded so true. I realized that the motto, I'll sleep when I'm dead, however tongue-in-cheek, really was deadly. I'm far from being the only one dealing with insomnia. Millions of us, more than a quarter of the population, in fact, are suffering individually and collectively. The Pandora's box of maladies associated with chronic insufficient sleep is well documented. Substance abuse, obesity, strokes, accidents, heart disease, anxiety, depression, dementia, death, diabetes, higher mortality rate, poor memory, fatigue, high blood pressure, impaired decision-making. Remember the Challenger crash? It's been traced to insomnia. So yeah, the space shuttle, the Challenger space shuttle. Knowing all this kept me up at night. So having this information did not help my sleep. Just made me more anxious, right? You're lying awake and you're going, oh my God, if I don't go to sleep, I'm going to get heart disease, depression, death, blah, blah, blah. Of course, simply acknowledging that sleep is vitally important to one's health doesn't cure stubborn sleep issues. That knowledge can even make insomnia worse. As a biological being in a mechanized world, how do I rewild myself? How do I reclaim my innate rhythms and optimal health and sleep? Knowing I was undermining my sleep and co-creating a sleepless planet by perpetuating mottos like I'll sleep like when I'm dead was an important first step. Work hard, play hard isn't the best rule to live by either. How about this instead? Work thoughtfully, play kindly, rest deeply. We are elemental beings. I've divided this book up into 4 sections after the 4 elements: air, earth, fire, water. This book is full of a ton of ideas for people who want to sleep better. It might even be a little overwhelming to some. Yeah, you're right, Kiki. It's the story of how I healed myself from insomnia over a period of about 3 years while making this book, and an attempt to model an approach for others seeking to improve their sleep. It's all about the process, and it's very important not to try to do everything at once. Everyone has a slightly different path to travel. Right again, my furry pal. No 2 forms of insomnia are the same. We each have different reasons for sleeping poorly, different biological makeups and cultural backgrounds. Gosh, I'm even a different species. Okay, Kiki, I think you're probably the only non-human animal who's going to read this. Haha, yeah, that's likely. But I definitely won't be the only non-human animal to benefit if humans slow down, turn off the lights, and start sleeping better. And I will stop there. That's my intro.
I loved it.
Good. Very nice.
So you're my first people to actually get a sneak preview, you know? It's just me and my publisher and editor at this point, and now you. So
Yeah.
Great. Wow, it's I look forward to the final product.
Yeah. When's it coming out?
in November,
Yay.
this November, yeah.
Yeah, I'm very interested in it, and your artwork is wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's 230 pages, 4 sections, and each one is experiential. So I lived it, I practiced it, and I could see, where it was making the difference. So it was tremendously helpful.
Yeah.
Well, drawing it. And gosh, drawing a graphic novel slows us down, doesn't it?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'd love to hear anything, you know, you have to say or questions for me because we have about 10 minutes left. So yeah, I'd love to just have a conversation with y'all or, you
Oh,
know, feel free to talk about your work.
yeah, definitely. Anybody else? Anybody with questions? I know I have one. Being the host, I probably shouldn't. Personally, I was very interested in your layout format. I mean, I know that the 2x6 panel is one of the most common compositions out in the medium, but at the same time, it was clear that you were doing a whole lot of variation with that, and I was just sort of wondering, is sort of using that as a guideline or sort of interested in how you were sort of deviating from that standard grid.
Yeah, I use it as a kind of architectural guideline. So just having it underneath was really helpful. So with Queen of Snails, I lightly penciled in the grid on every page and then, you know, penciled the drawings on top. But it's modular, right? So you can turn the 6 panels into one panel, one big full page panel, or 3 horizontal panels, or 2 tall vertical panels, or any combination thereof. So yeah, I like having gutters. I like doing that most of the time, and I also like just going wild and doing different things. And sometimes, you know, when the story wants it, you want to go diagonal to show tension, or, you know, you want to just forget about having panels all together and bleed off the page, or do a few pages with no text. So, but I do like having that guideline underneath to kind of keep me grounded. Yeah.
Is that a question?
I feel like I can faintly hear somebody, but can't make out what they're saying. I think it's just background noise,
Okay.
maybe. I don't know.
Okay.
Not in my house. My house is empty.
Yeah.
Well, anybody else?
No questions. I'm just, once again, I'm amazed by her work, and I like how some of the things overlapped.
Yeah. I have a question.
You.
What type of medium is used, and do you ever use the digital? Do you turn it in digitally or the inked version, hard copy?
Yeah, I really love to do analog old school. That's where my joy is. So I've tried digital and I just don't love it. I don't love the process. And I do digital color. I'm actually like super fast, know all the shortcuts in Photoshop, and have used it quite a lot, like as a, you know, as a graphic designer and illustrator. But man, if I can just use analog materials, I'm so much happier.
Nice.
So, you know, where I'll do the inking and everything analog, and then I scan it in. And if I'm adding color, I'll usually add the color in Photoshop, and then I'll place it in Adobe InDesign. And now with this book that I just read from, with Sleepless Planet, I did, as I mentioned earlier, I created a digital font from my handwriting. And so I place the writing and I draw the speech bubbles and thought bubbles in Adobe InDesign. So it's I guess you could say it's hybrid. And then I turn it in that way as a PDF. So it's basically ready to print. It's basically ready to publish. the way I turn it in. Yeah.
And then likewise, are they going to make the book hard copy only, or are they going to be looking at releasing it digitally also?
That's a really good question. I'm actually not sure what the plan is with that. I know it's coming out in paperback, and I think Queen of Snails is available digitally by now. So I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, but it'll come out in paperback in November. And they do a beautiful job in production at Graphic Mundi.
Did you
They'll
say it's available digitally right now?
It's not available digitally right now. No,
Okay.
it's still in production, so it's
That's what I thought. Okay. Thank
release
you for
date is in
clarifying.
November. Yeah, yeah, that's right. But good question. Thank you for that. Hi, Donna.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I've got the con crud and I forgot to set my alarm.
Oh,
But I
no.
know that Bill and you must have run a really good meeting. And I know it was recorded, so I know it's great. And so I'm looking forward to seeing it up on the YouTube. Sorry about that. It's just Emerald City. We all catch the con crud.
Oh,
Sorry.
man, I'm sorry. I hope you feel better soon.
I will. I'm just saying I'm sorry about being late, but I'm sure you guys ran it just beautiful. Bill always does. And so I know there'll be a great recorded session.
Could you talk a little bit more about your mind map process?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I start with a blank sheet of paper, often in my journal. It's really low stakes. I don't plan on anybody ever seeing it. And, I'll put my central idea kind of in the middle of the page, and I'll draw a shape around it to kind of encapsulate it. And then I'll draw tendrils out, and they basically represent what my brain is doing. Like our brains shoot out these trajectories going, oh, this reminds me of that. So it's like a free association game. And you just don't take it too seriously, right? It's free writing, it's sloppy, it's messy, it doesn't have to look nice. Colors can be helpful to kind of encode things for yourself and to keep it visually interesting and moving. So from the central theme, you might have some tendrils come out that give you some insight into what sub-themes might be contained in your story. And as you branch out from the center, you could kind of look at it as an aerial view of a tree, where you have the center stem, the center trunk is your central idea concept for your story. And then things branch outward, and the further you get from the trunk, the smaller and more detailed they become. You could look at it that way. Some kind of organic shape like that. And you saw Nick Susanis's. He did his in columns and just like loads of different connections. His brain is wild. Like if you've ever had a conversation with Nick Susanis, there's so many associations and images that come up in conversation. So this is like a conversation with yourself about your project, where you're not trying to make it beautiful yet. It's basically a pre-writing and pre-drawing exercise. So I like to do it in my journal. Sometimes I've had students, they like to use like a nice big huge piece of paper, a poster board or butcher block paper, so that they feel less constrained. So you can experiment. You could use a blackboard or a dry erase board. That would be cool.
I have another question, if it's okay.
Mhm.
I was really fascinated by that that braid model of the storyline. Have you actually created a book based on that one already?
Yeah, the Queen of Snails.
Oh, that's the one.
Yeah. That came out in 2022. So is autobiographical, but it also looks at family history and cultural history and things that helped shape my families and my own experiences. So that's how things are braided together there. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how you ended up breaking the storyline out to fit based on that model?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about the different kind of tendrils of story, if you will, and then how they interconnect. So the image really just helped me think through, what are those themes and sub-themes and how are they going to connect? And then from there, I made outlines and started doing some rough, some rough scripting, and then I built the story from there. But it was something that helped center me and helped me imagine what the story might look like. Yeah. I wanted to put up a slide before we close to show you how to get in touch with me.
Good.
I didn't want to miss that bit. So I do private coaching with people who are developing their long form works, their graphic novels. And I offer a free Zoom session to talk about your project. So I'm really fortunate. I get to work with some really cool people all over the world who are working on their books. And it's like the most fun job ever. So feel free to contact me. There's like no strings attached with the 45 minutes. I just love to get to know people and their work. So no pressure. And then you can find me on Instagram, and there's my website. And I haven't been on social media much for a few months because I've been really busy and I don't want to feel stressed out because I'm really focused on sleeping well. So you can imagine what I try not to take in. So it can be some good to myself and the rest of the world still. But I love getting emails, and there's my personal email address right there. And I do post things occasionally on Instagram and would love to follow you back. So yeah.
Well, anyway, that was fantastic, Maureen. Thank you once again for agreeing to talk with us.